Hi everybody, welcome to Module 3, Power. I'm here today with Dr. Navin and Professor Ned Rossiter. And today we're going to introduce you to the module and talk a little bit about some of the key concepts. First, I'm going to set the scene by recapping where we're up to in this unit and where this module about power fits in. So going back a few weeks to Module 1, we spent a bit of time defining data. We asked, what is it? And we thought about how data is information gathered for analysis. We talked about how data is a way of approaching the world, or what Boyd and Crawford call a computational turn. We also spent some time thinking about the question, where is data? And we decided that it's pretty much everywhere these days. It's relevant to all parts of our personal and professional lives. In this unit, we're perfectly clear that thinking and analysing data is not just for media professionals, but for everyone. And in Module 1, we began to think about some ideas and issues associated with data. Some ideas from the readings include the importance of knowing your sample and the value of big data and small data. Next, in Module 2, we used data. For your assignments, you gathered data about a topic, and in this respect, data was your perspective on the topic. In terms of the language and concepts of the unit, we can say that your use of data in relation to your topic is an example of mediation. Data was your entryway into the topic, not your own opinion or your tutor's opinion or your friends. Now, in Module 3, we're going to be critical of data. Now that we've spent some time getting to know data and how it works, mediating the world, we're going to stand back and think about it critically. We'll do this together over the next few weeks, but you'll also be doing this on your own when you write your critical reflections for the final assessment. Remember, this process of being critical about stuff is why we're at university. We're not just here to train for work, and we're not here to accept things without questioning them. We're here to question things, to use knowledge to question things, and through this process know things better and make things better. All that said, one way to step back and be critical of data is to use the concept of power. Here's one simple definition of power, which I've adapted from Castell's. Thinking about power involves thinking about who can influence what society looks like, who controls the means to allow such influence, and who benefits from this influence. For us in this unit, the problem of power, and it is a problem, is important in these ways, and others of course. In terms of access to data, and this is something Boyd and Crawford discuss. In terms of the control of data and meaning, and this is something Langlois discussed. In terms of the opportunities data provides for understanding the world, each other, and making meaning, and this is also something that Langlois discussed. And another example of data and control raised by Langlois in the last couple of weeks is the commercialization of social media algorithms and the creation of grey profiles. There are many other cases in this unit where the problem of power is important. There's personalization, and how personalization is an example of power because involved really is just the creation of generic versions of ourselves. Getting a general version of yourself is hardly empowering, is it? And another example from your research for assessment 2 is Foucault's concept of power formations, illustrated for us in most students' reliance on Google data tools when doing that assignment.
One of the things that I wanted to touch on in my 3 minutes was about the tensions between government and large tech companies hoovering up data and providing services as a consequence. It's one of the themes that Evgeny Morozov raises in many of the articles he has in The Guardian, which you can look at by clicking on his name in the Guardian web link, which is one of this module's readings. What he is suggesting here is that corporate power, through their, and we can think of some very big names that we know of and some even bigger ones that we've never heard of, control over data are increasingly shifting power away from governments to the private sector. So in the past, we'd always thought of this through the process of privatisation, and we've seen this happen in a broad range of areas within your lifetimes. Examples of this have been the privatisation of telecoms and communication systems, privatisation of power generation and supply. So on the face of it, sometimes it seems quite compelling. So we could envisage Alphabet, Google's parent company, releasing Flow onto Sydney, which is new software using data to mitigate the effects of parking via data that we all share. We could have a super efficient real-time auction of each parking spot at Bondi Beach. Alphabet is also looking at a car sharing service based on data to match up drivers and passengers heading in the same direction. Maybe you could add in a small dating service as well. It all seems pretty good, right? Meet some other nice singles, get a day at the beach without having to hunt around forever looking for a park. The local government gets a slice from the parking auction fees, and in some respects, perhaps it takes the pressure off having to try to work out, build, and maintain public transport systems. Seems kind of like a win-win. However, some of the forays of the private sector into the public domain, like with Obamacare in the US and Google Fiber, have resulted in less options as some of the providers realize that some of these essential services are loss makers. In a way, one of the arguments why governments need to provide these services via taxation. So they cut their losses, quietly exit the scene, leaving citizens deprived of an important service. Morozov makes this very provocative statement at one of these articles. In the end, welfare by corporations is nothing but welfare for corporations.
So what I was interested in doing is talking a bit to these three organising categories and concepts that we have in this unit on data, mediation and power. And I thought one thing I could do is, well, set up another kind of definition of power. One that I've always liked from the work of the French philosopher Michel Foucault was that power is productive. Rather than simply controlling or oppressive, it's productive and it's distributed through a social body. So if you take that as a point of departure, how then can we then move into a broader discussion around data and mediation? So I think one thing we can do is begin to think of data in terms of the analytical optic it provides to start thinking about geopolitics in another way. So much of the focus we have in political economy of media is around the so-called kind of FANG industries, the Facebook, Amazon, Netflix, Google, as though, you know, they have this kind of controlling presence within the world and our experience of it as it's mediated through such platforms. One of the things that's become interesting in recent tech reporting and business pages in the newspapers has been just the amount of money pouring into the Chinese tech sector. You have 4 trillion kind of movement of markets in the US coming out of Silicon Valley, but you've got 1 trillion coming in through China. I think that's a really kind of important signal for us to think about where things are going and what sort of presence these platforms have in our lives beyond just sort of peculiar national boundaries, let's say, or national media cultures.
I mean, I guess there's been a real push for some of the FANG industries to try and push into those new spaces like India and China, and I guess there's been very mixed kind of results.
New spaces and new sectors. Amazon, for example, is moving not just into the sale of books, as we know, but the provision of all kinds of services. Similarly, Alibaba, a Chinese tech company, is starting to make a presence in Australia. And so it will be really interesting to see how that impacts upon not just the media industries per se, but also the supermarkets and the control of supply chains, delivery of services and products to consumers. I mean, in thinking about power as productive, it sort of asks us also to think a little bit about the media form. So it becomes a route into thinking of medium theory, a tradition that's come out of Canada in the 1950s with people like Harold Innis, and then made a bit more kind of popular and visible with people like Marshall McLuhan. In the German front, we have scholars like Friedrich Hitler. From this, we have an awareness now within the field that there's not this thing called net neutrality or tech neutrality, but technology, has properties, it has tendencies, has capacities, it can perform, has agency. Some might go so far as to say it does have a determining effect on the world, but if we think of it in terms of, let's just say, properties, very sort of simply, we're then in a position to start describing, well, what is the difference between something like Google as a search engine and Amazon or Facebook or Twitter? And this starts to lead us into another dimension of power, namely the ways in which its architectures are encoded at the level of script, at the level of algorithm. And we can begin to start talking about something like algorithmic governance or algorithmic power. How are these seemingly invisible black box forces, shaping our lives? How do we begin to have some kind of analytical inroads into the black box? How do we kind of re-engineer or deconstruct or reproduce an algorithm. One of the ways we can do this is just, again, I think through a description and looking at the ways in which we perform differently across different platforms. Platforms, by the way, we could define as forms that are social and technical that, you know, have a capacity to organise our lives and economy in different ways. And we can then speak of platform capitalism as the kind of monopoly effects that arise from that.
I guess in terms of thinking about the impact of software and architecture, these are issues that we picked up with the Langlois reading in relation to meaning and stuff, right?
Yeah, and I think that she talks about, in some ways I find Langlois and Fuchs and a lot of critics of social media and digital networked media quite frustrating, because it appears that the only way to reach that idea of power as productive is to avoid commercial social media platforms. I'm often wondering, well, is there, I totally understand the idea that power can be productive and empowering. It's very frustrating because nobody appears to have thought of a way to experience that within the commercial platforms other than to find alternate platforms. One simple thing that is mentioned a lot is transparency of knowing how the algorithms work would make a difference. But what are your thoughts, guys, on that idea of power as productive within such a commercially driven environment? How is it possible to start thinking in those terms within that environment? Because I'm not seeing much that's resonating with me in terms of how to achieve that.
Yeah, I mean, I hear your frustration, because quite often I feel that a little bit as well. And I guess there's always that tension with transparency and private, part of how private companies make their money is to make things proprietary, to be able to have time in the market or time in a market to be able to make money from those kind of technologies or those affordances. And so there is that real tension.
I mean, one of the clear things this raises for me is the question of political autonomy. So, for example, we have the Occupy movements, the squares, we have any number of kind of protest movements around the world in the last decade. No matter how kind of progressive and sort of radical that they may be, inevitably their data infrastructures end up being quite centralized, which is to say they end up siphoning through a data center somewhere in the world. Now, these architectures are based around extraction of data and the monetization of it. So one of the kind of interesting developments with regard to thinking of power in other ways in terms of, say, autonomy is to say, I don't think we're able to claim or have a stake in Facebook. And there have been numerous attempts to develop alternative Facebooks that have, failed for various reasons. But it's sort of interesting to think on smaller scales as well. What does it mean to produce infrastructure in autonomous, independent ways? I mean, we saw this very clearly in Hong Kong during the umbrella movements, where there was off-the-grid Bluetooth communications, which meant that nothing was ever kind of tracked or recorded or subject to the kind of scrutiny and surveillance that happens when it's moving through a data center. Another example would be something very simple. File sharing is something that we all grew up with in the 90s when the internet came into our lives. And it continues to be, a very kind of popular, dominant kind of practice in a lot of ways. But how to bring file sharing off the grid and think about infrastructure in different ways? Well, a really simple example of that is the kind of case of USB libraries, where, or could USB movies, USB music, whatever the kind of content is, as long as it can be stored on a USB, it's sort of off the grid and we can change it and share it around, swap it, and we're kind of building collective infrastructures in a way that's not sort of open to the scrutiny and control and extraction that we see with platform capitalism.
Yeah. I mean, I guess one of the things that we're finding and experiencing now is just the ability to set up really lean, localized Wi-Fi networks, to set up things that are free from that kind of scrutiny and surveillance, that broad corporate and government surveillance apparatus. And I think that's something that is going to be increasing as there is more resistance to it. But it's a trade-off, isn't it, right? If everyone is using those kind of systems, then you still want to be able to access everyone else. That's part of it.
I'm not so sure. I mean, do we really need 500 friends? One of the things that I find very attractive about these sort of developments and experiments is that it's not even so much a way to kind of reclaim space independent from, government surveillance or, commercial scrutiny. But to bring it back to this question of algorithmic governance, one of the ways we see that happening really kind of clearly, I think, and in very pernicious ways, it does tie into surveillance to an extent, that's for sure, is, the rise of the quantified self, right? People running around with their Fitbits, desperate to become normative subjects that make 10,000 steps a day. And you know what? If you don't, your insurance company is going to hit you with a higher premium next year. Well, that's something to be pretty fearful and disturbed by, I find. We see this all the time when you take out your kind of health insurance or your motor vehicle insurance or your home insurance. The first thing you're asked is, what's your street address? What I found interesting in a recent claim I tried making was that I was indeed asked to submit my address. I did, and my fees had gone up for the year. So I said, well, look, I tell you what if I park my car around the corner? How much is my premium going to be then? Oh, well, yeah, hey, it's going to be $300 cheaper. Just tell us that's your address. Yeah, right. Well, all right, okay. Yeah. You sort of move outside of that grid of, normativity a little bit, where you've had high crime rates based on data analytics of the number of crimes in your area, and you can have a better sort of premium. So it's also about us then playing with what we know about local geographies off against the data analytic machine.